I'm a strong believer in open access journals, and I was one of the signatories of the Varmus-Brown letter to Science, which called for a boycott of journals which wouldn't go open access. But that letter eventually led to Harold Varmus and Michael Eisen and Pat Brown starting the PLOS journals, which I think have been very successful. And I was convinced of the need for open access journals by a number of arguments. The first is that there has been a long, actually quite remarkable situation in the biological database world. When the nucleotide, the DNA sequence databases were first established in Heidelberg at the European Molecular Biology Lab in 1982, and by the NIH in the States very soon after. Both of these databases, which archive the world's public DNA sequence data, both of them were established on the grounds that these data were open and public to everyone. So I could go today to the EMBL nucleotide sequence data library or to GenBank, and if I had the computer capacity, I could download it in its entirety, I could wrap it up in pink ribbon, and I could sell it legally. The access is totally unconstrained, and I think without that tradition, then, or without that principle of open access, then scientists would have been unwilling to deposit nucleic acid sequence data, DNA sequence data, in these databases. And without the archiving and deposition of DNA sequence data, then much of the analysis of genomes, for example the human genome, much of that analysis would simply be impossible because we wouldn't have access to the data. So that was a very good principle established over 20 years ago, and in retrospect was not self-evident, because the tradition in other fields, for example in chemistry, has been that there are large archival databases, but they're commercial. They are either owned by commercial companies, or they are owned, for example, by the American Chemical Society, which, although a not-for-loss corporation, charges its users an arm and a leg for access to these data, although these data, of course, come from the public domain by and large. So, in retrospect, it wasn't self-evident that the DNA sequence databases would be open access, but they are, and that established a very important principle. And it also established a principle or a tradition in the bioinformatics world that software is by and large open access. So nearly all of the major programs we use for the analysis of sequence data are freely and publicly available. And again, that's not true in chemistry, where most of the software which chemists use is commercial, and you buy it from commercial companies. It's true that in bioinformatics you can go to a company and buy a package of programs, but I've never had to do so in my career, and most bioinformaticists can find all the software that they need as open source software, and that has had great advantages out of the field. Now, in publishing in scientific papers, what's surprising is how long it took the community to wake up to the fact that we were freely giving our papers to journals. We were freely donating our time and energy to journals as editors, members of editorial boards, or as referees. And then we were buying back this corpus of knowledge, either personally or through our libraries, university libraries, at great cost. And it took quite a long time before the community as a whole woke up to this extraordinary anomaly. And I think what clearly triggered one of the triggers of the open access movement in journal publishing was the fact that certain publishers were increasing the cost of their journals to libraries in particular, way above the rate of inflation. And we started getting or seeing that our university libraries were having to cut journals simply because they could not afford the price of the subscriptions, because there's no way that the budgets of departmental or university libraries is going to increase at the same rate, and therefore our access at that time, primarily print copies of the journals, was being restricted, was getting more difficult. I think that was one impetus for the open access publishing movement. But I think there were others. Second was the realization that the growth of the biomedical literature, at least, is so large that we are going to have to use computational techniques to access that literature. And that, of course, is made possible by the fact that most of the scientific literature, modern literature, is now available electronically. And there's a very active field in computer science and natural language processing, in which one can use computer programs to analyze the text of the scientific literature, and that is one way in which one can attempt actually to try and find out what has been published. Now that's not possible unless that literature is freely available. At the moment, most natural language processing techniques are using abstracts, because abstracts are freely available because of the pressure imposed on the publishers by the National Library of Medicine of the NIH through their Medline project. And nearly all publishers now make freely available abstracts of papers to Medline, and usually do so in advance of publication. And that is wonderful, but of course there's an enormous difference between abstracts and full text. This sort of analysis of literature really only works, in fact, in a very similar way to DNA sequence data, if all the data is available in one place, in one archive. So with sequence data, we have GenBank and the EMBL data library, which are essentially the same. They swap data every night. And the NIH have started an archive called PubMed Central for the biomedical literature, and the Wellcome Trust have very recently announced a similar project in the UK, and there will clearly be very close collaboration between the new UK project and PubMed Central at the NCBI. This will allow access to complete text of all the open access literature, but at the moment, and of course that is but a fraction. For me, these are two of the most important reasons for open access. I mean, the first being just the commercial reality and the feeling that we've been ripped off by the commercial publishers for far too long, and the second, the kind of utilitarian argument that if all the scientific literature were open access, then computational techniques for its analysis would be enormously enabled. The third, of course, is the fact that if you go to a third world country, if you go to the Department of Zoology in the University of Nairobi, in Kenya, and look at their library, look at their journals, and it's absolutely appalling what they have access to in paper access. And the fact that nearly all major journals, not nearly all major journals, are now published electronically, at least gives them, in principle, gives them a mode of access through the internet. Now, the World Health Organization and others have been fairly active, and particularly in the medical literature, and some of the commercial publishers have indeed signed on with programs which make their journals freely available to third world countries, and that's great, but it's not clear that how long those will be sustained. They could be switched off tomorrow, because they're at the whims of the commercial publishers, and of course they're not complete. There will still be journals which a researcher in Nairobi will not have electronic access to without payment, and if the University of Cambridge can't afford to buy electronic access to all the journals it needs, I'm damn sure the University of Nairobi can't.